There's a quiet shift happening across the Tasman Sea. Australians trading sun-scorched suburbs for rolling green hills, glacial lakes, and a slower pace of life in New Zealand. Now, before all my Kiwi viewers start writing angry comments about how Australians are driving up house prices, spoiler alert, they're probably right. Let's dive into why Australians are actually choosing to spend their retirement years in Middle-earth. And look, I know what you're thinking. Isn't everyone leaving New Zealand right now? Well, yes. Record numbers of Kiwis have been heading to Australia lately. In the year ending September 2025, a staggering 72,700 New Zealanders departed, with most heading straight to Australia for better wages and opportunities. But here's the twist. Whilst young Kiwis are chasing bigger paychecks in Queensland and New South Wales, older Australians are doing the reverse migration for retirement. It's like a really expensive game of musical chairs, but with citizenship agreements and superannuation transfers. So settle in, and let's explore why Australians are choosing to retire in the land of the long white cloud. 1. The Trans-Tasman advantage. First things first. The biggest reason Australians can even consider this move? The Trans-Tasman travel arrangement. This beautiful piece of bureaucracy means that if you're holding an Australian passport, you can rock up to New Zealand and live there indefinitely. No visa applications, no sponsorship requirements, no proving you've got $750,000 burning a hole in your pocket like other retirees need. You literally just go. Compare that to Americans, Brits, or anyone else who wants to retire in New Zealand. They need to fork out 750,000 New Zealand dollars to invest, plus another 500,000 New Zealand dollars for living expenses, and prove they've got an annual income of at least 60,000 New Zealand dollars. That's over $1 million in New Zealand currency, or about 700,000 US dollars, just for the privilege of applying for a temporary retirement visitor visa. And even then, you can't work, and you're only allowed to stay for 2 years before having to reapply. Australians? Nah, mate, you just hop on a 3-hour flight from Sydney to Auckland, and you're done. It's easier than moving from Perth to Melbourne, and considerably cheaper. You can find a one-way economy flight from Auckland to Brisbane costing around 125 New Zealand dollars. That's less than most people spend on a night out. 2. The scenery. Let's be honest. This is why most people move to New Zealand, and it's probably the biggest drawcard for Australian retirees. New Zealand's scenery is absolutely bonkers. We're talking snow-capped mountains, pristine lakes, glaciers, fjords, untouched beaches, and rainforests all within a few hours' drive of each other. Australia's beautiful in its own way. We've got red deserts, stunning beaches, and the Great Barrier Reef. But New Zealand packs an almost ludicrous variety of landscapes into a country roughly the size of Victoria. You can literally wake up near a beach, drive through wine country, have lunch by an alpine lake, and watch the sunset from a mountain peak, all in the same day. Try doing that from Adelaide. And it's not just the diversity, it's how accessible it all is. New Zealand's walking tracks and hiking trails are world-class, well-maintained, and often free. The government-run Department of Conservation maintains over 950 huts and thousands of kilometers of tracks throughout the country. For retirees who want to stay active and explore the outdoors without breaking the bank, New Zealand is paradise. The country was literally the backdrop for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Hobbit films, and countless other major productions. When directors want to film impossibly beautiful fantasy landscapes, they come to New Zealand. That should tell you something. Plus, for Australian retirees coming from places like Western Sydney, Brisbane's outer suburbs, or the urban sprawl of Melbourne, New Zealand offers something increasingly rare: uncrowded spaces. You can visit stunning beaches and parks without fighting through throngs of people. The population density is considerably lower, which means more room to breathe and less stress. As one Australian expat put it, the quality of life for a relaxed retirement is far better than we could have afforded in the UK or Australia's major cities, with mountains, beaches, and incredible scenery all within easy reach. 3. The lifestyle factor, particularly outside Auckland. Here's where things get really interesting. Australia and New Zealand share a lot culturally. Same language, similar slang, with some hilarious differences. Love of rugby and cricket, and that distinctly laid-back Commonwealth vibe. But New Zealand takes the relaxed lifestyle to another level. Kiwis genuinely live by the work-to-live philosophy rather than live-to-work. The pace of life is slower, particularly outside Auckland. People actually have hobbies and time to pursue them. There's less materialism, less stress, and This is crucial for retirees, less emphasis on keeping up appearances. Multiple Australian expats living in New Zealand report the same observation. Society is more egalitarian, less obsessed with status symbols, and people don't define themselves primarily by their occupation. For retirees who've spent decades in the rat race, this cultural shift can feel like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. The cities are also noticeably less crowded. Wellington, New Zealand's capital, has a population of about 215,000. Christchurch, the largest South Island city, sits around 380,000. Compare that to Sydney's 5.3 million or Melbourne's 5 million, and you start to understand the appeal. You can actually find a car park. Traffic jams are measured in minutes, not hours. The chemist doesn't have a 45-minute wait. Safety is another major factor. New Zealand consistently ranks as one of the safest countries in the world. It's currently third on the Global Peace Index. Low crime rates, very little violent crime, virtually no guns, and a stable political environment create a sense of security that's particularly appealing to retirees. You can leave your doors unlocked in many areas, kids can bike around town, and walking at night doesn't require a security escort. 4. The cost of living reality check. All right, here's where we need to get real. New Zealand is not a cheap country. In fact, the cost of living is roughly 9% higher than the United States, and it can be more expensive than many Australian cities depending on where you're coming from and where you're going. Let's break this down properly. According to 2025 data, housing costs in New Zealand vary dramatically by location. Auckland, around 1,250 to 1,350 New Zealand dollars per month for a one-bedroom apartment in the city centre, depending on suburb and building age. Wellington, roughly 1,000 to 1,100 New Zealand dollars per month, with newer inner-city apartments often higher. Christchurch, about 800 to 900 New Zealand dollars per month, reflecting a more balanced post-rebuild housing market. Smaller towns and regional areas, typically 600 to 950 New Zealand dollars per month, though popular lifestyle towns can push higher. Compare that to Australian cities, and it's complicated. Sydney and Melbourne are definitely more expensive for rent, but regional Australian centres can be cheaper than even Christchurch. The real advantage for Australian retirees often comes from selling property in Australia's inflated market and buying in New Zealand's regional areas. Groceries are notoriously expensive in New Zealand. Here's a fun fact that perfectly captures this. You can buy New Zealand lamb and Sauvignon Blanc cheaper in London than in Auckland. The country exports so much of its quality produce that locals pay premium prices. A typical weekly grocery shop for two people can easily run 200 to 300 New Zealand dollars, and that's not even buying fancy stuff. Petrol is generally comparable to Australia, though it fluctuates. Utilities for an average apartment run about 150 to 200 New Zealand dollars monthly. Dining out is expensive. A meal for two at a mid-range restaurant will set you back 80 to 100 New Zealand dollars, excluding drinks. A pint of beer at a pub costs 8 to 12 New Zealand dollars. According to financial estimates, a single person needs about 35,000 to 45,000 New Zealand dollars per year for a modest lifestyle, whilst a couple needs 60,000 to 80,000 New Zealand dollars. That's roughly equivalent to 32,000 to 42,000 Australian dollars for singles and 55,000 to 73,000 Australian dollars for couples. However, and this is crucial, these costs are heavily dependent on where you retire. Auckland and Wellington are expensive, but regional areas like Southland, the far north, North Canterbury, or the Catlins offer significantly cheaper living while still providing excellent access to nature, healthcare, and community. Here's the thing that often tips the scales for Australians. Property prices in many New Zealand regions are still reasonable compared to Australia's major cities. You can buy a decent house in Christchurch, Dunedin, or regional centres for prices that seem almost quaint to someone selling a Sydney or Melbourne property. That capital transfer can set you up very comfortably indeed. 5. The Social Security Dance. Let's talk about everyone's favorite topic: government benefits and pensions. This is where the Trans-Tasman relationship gets properly complicated, so pay attention. Australia's retirement system centers around two things: compulsory superannuation that you've been paying into throughout your working life, and the age pension, which is means-tested. New Zealand's system is different. They've got a universal pension called New Zealand Superannuation and a voluntary savings scheme called KiwiSaver. If you're an Australian retiring to New Zealand, here's what happens with your super. You can access it normally, provided you meet the standard conditions of release. The brilliant part? Australia and New Zealand have a social security agreement that allows you to transfer your Australian super into a KiwiSaver account if you want to. Once you're 60, super withdrawals are generally tax-free in Australia, though you'll want to check how New Zealand treats that income for tax purposes. To qualify for New Zealand super, you need 10 years of residency in New Zealand, with 5 of those years being after age 50. But thanks to the Social Security Agreement, your time living in Australia can count toward both countries' pension requirements. This means many Australian retirees end up receiving partial payments from both Australia and New Zealand. Currently, as of late 2025, the full New Zealand superannuation rate for a single person living alone is about 28,000 to 30,000 New Zealand dollars per year, whilst couples receive about 43,000 to 46,000 New Zealand dollars combined. That's universal. Everyone gets it regardless of assets, which is very different from Australia's means-tested age pension. The Australian age pension, by comparison, maxes out at about 30,646 Australian dollars annually for singles, and 46,202 Australian dollars for couples for the period from September 2025 to March 2026, but only if you pass the assets and income tests. The practical upshot? Many Australian retirees find themselves with a combination of their Australian super, potentially some Australian age pension, and eventually New Zealand super once they've met the residency requirements. It's not going to make you rich, but it provides a decent foundation, especially in New Zealand's more affordable regional areas. 6. The friendship and community angle. Here's something that doesn't show up in the statistics but matters enormously for retirement happiness: the people. New Zealanders have a well-deserved reputation for being friendly, down-to-earth, and welcoming. The culture values humility over bragging, community over individualism, and genuine connection over status symbols. For Australian retirees, this feels familiar enough to be comfortable but different enough to be refreshing. Regional New Zealand communities in particular are known for their strong social bonds. Small towns have regular events, farmers' markets, community fundraisers, local sports clubs, and volunteer opportunities. It's easy to get involved, make friends, and feel like you belong. This is crucial for retirees who might be leaving behind established social networks in Australia. There's also a significant Australian expat community already established in New Zealand, particularly in cities like Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch. This means you can find people who've been through the same transition and can offer advice on everything from navigating healthcare to finding the best fish and chips. The shared cultural background helps enormously. You're not dealing with language barriers, radically different customs, or trying to decipher an entirely foreign system. You can watch the same sports, understand the humor, and navigate bureaucracy without too much confusion. Plus, let's be honest, Kiwis and Australians have a beautiful sibling rivalry going on. It's all good-natured ribbing about rugby, cricket, and who invented the pavlova. For Australian retirees, this banter feels like home. So why are Australians choosing to retire in New Zealand, and would it work for you? The truth is, New Zealand offers something increasingly rare in our modern world: a chance to genuinely slow down and enjoy a high quality of life surrounded by spectacular natural beauty in a safe, stable, welcoming society that shares your language and culture. For Australian retirees with adequate financial resources and a genuine love of the outdoors, it's an almost perfect fit. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it rains a lot. Yes, you'll be far from international travel hubs. And yes, you'll spend a disturbing amount of time arguing about whether pavlova is Australian or Kiwi. But in exchange, you get to wake up to views that make you question whether you're still on Earth. You get to live in a society that values people over profit, community over competition, and quality time over quarterly earnings. You get access to world-class healthcare, some of the safest communities on the planet, and outdoor recreation that would cost a fortune anywhere else. You get to spend your retirement years actually living, instead of just existing. Is it for everyone? Absolutely not. But for the right Australian retiree, someone who's spent decades in the grind, who's ready to trade status for satisfaction, and who genuinely wants to spend their golden years surrounded by silver ferns and turquoise lakes, New Zealand might just be paradise. Just remember, the All Blacks are sacred, Marmite and Vegemite are not the same thing, and for the love of all that's holy, don't call it Australia's seventh state. unless you want to see just how quickly a normally laid-back Kiwi can get very unlaid back. Wherever you retire, make sure it's somewhere that makes you genuinely happy, not just somewhere that looks good on Instagram. Although, let's be real, New Zealand does look absolutely brilliant on Instagram. Cheers, and happy retirement planning.